the developments that have taken place, and do you think there's a cause to worry for Pakistan?
Big issue shaping the region is the rise of China. China has now become the largest procurer of energy from the Middle East. The United States used to be the largest for a long period of time. The Chinese are deepening their ties and relationships with the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, as we've seen, and Iran.
How things are shaping up with the IMF right now, some of these predictions are coming to life.
Russia is not an export partner for Pakistan. It is not an important market for Pakistan. Even in the energy side, the key markets and allies for Pakistan are Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia.
Welcome to this new episode of Political Economy this week with Asad Ejaz Butt. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm joined by Uzair Younas, who's associated with the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. I was finally successfully able to chase down Uzair to join us on this show. And of course, he's a shining star. We hear his opinions, his views on Pakistan's economy, and then, of course, also on the on foreign policy issues on the social media, on various platforms. Let me welcome Uzair. Uzair, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. And Uzair, it's an interesting time in the region. I wanted to talk to you about Middle East in particular, major realignment happening there. And of course, there have been some discussions on what lies ahead for Pakistan and what Pakistan should take away from the developments taking place in the Middle East. How do you see the developments that have taken place, and do you think there's a cause to worry for Pakistan?
Well, before I answer the second question, I'll sort of share a bit of a framework in terms of how I'm thinking about the developments in the region. There are 3 or 4 broad themes that we need to be aware of in terms of what's going on here. The first among them is that there is a major shift in terms of how global energy flows are going to happen in the next few years, and how those flows will be affected by investments in renewable and clean energy, primarily due to the growing climate crisis around the world. As a result of that, you have the United States and Europe and other countries heavily investing in renewable energy, battery storage, etc., which then means that the petrodollar states of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and others have to find a way to, develop and grow and thrive and remain successful in this new era. So that's number one. The second big issue shaping the region is the rise of China. China has now become the largest procurer of energy from the Middle East. The United States used to be the largest for a long period of time, which now means that the Chinese are deepening their ties and relationships with the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, as we've seen, and Iran. So that's number 2. The third big element of this is the United States' pivot into Asia, which began under President Obama's time, but it has accelerated primarily due to the sharpening rivalry between the United States and China. And so the United States, fatigued in Afghanistan, fatigued in the Middle East and its protracted conflicts, is now looking eastwards and saying, well, those are more important theaters for us to focus on. And so the Middle East, while it remains quite important, in Washington has sort of, diminished focus, at least from the administration's perspective. That's number 3. And number 4 in all of this is the youth bulge and the shift in the region in terms of the ideological underpinnings of the region. And we see this in particular with the ongoing social liberalization in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But we also see this shift reflected in terms of how countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are opening themselves up to Israel, for example. And so those are the broad themes that are shaping the region. And within the context of Pakistan, now coming to your question, as we see these 4 shifts, I think these are interesting and should be perceived as exciting, not problematic times for Pakistan, provided Pakistan understands how these shifts are going to change the economic, diplomatic, and strategic calculus of its strategic partners in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, and then play a role in terms of not only positioning itself as a partner in this new era for the region, but also leveraging its own capabilities to allow these countries to modernize in ways in which that not only strengthen this relationship, but also helps countries like Saudi Arabia make the necessary investment in sectors where perhaps Pakistani entrepreneurs, Pakistani technical talent can play a key role. So I think I view this as an opportunity, as an exciting time for Pakistan, provided Pakistani ruling elites understand how quickly the world is changing in the neighborhood around them.
Thank you, Uzair, for a very comprehensive answer. I think some of those points that you've raised are very exciting, but I'm particularly interested in the energy argument that you presented. Do you really think that this would have a very strong bearing on the oil prices, given that, a lot of time in the last couple of decades, Iran was sanctioned by the US, and the global oil supplies did not really include the supplies by Iran. And now when Iran chips in and is sort of effectively mainstreamed within this global oil supply chain, do you think that would have great, strong ramifications for oil prices? And do you think that would, sort of kick in something called an oil supply shock?
So look, I don't think there's going to be major supply shocks per se, but I agree with this perspective, which a lot of experts have, including folks like Megan O'Sullivan, who's at Harvard, Daniel Yergin, whose books, if you haven't read on energy, are a must read. And if you pay attention to what they're forecasting, the view that I agree with is that over time, as this transition towards clean and renewable energy accelerates, volatility in energy markets, particularly in the oil markets, will grow. And the reason it will grow is because as the world increasingly shifts towards electric mobility and things like that, investors in the traditional fossil fuel segments will continue to think about, okay, what's the longevity of the investments we're making? Will it be worthwhile? What happens if the electric mobility transition, for example, accelerates? What that means is that low-cost producers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, among others, will have in the near term more bargaining power. And we've seen this in the last few months alone, where the Saudis with OPEC Plus have proactively cut output to make sure that oil remains about $80 a barrel, because that's what they need to balance the budgets. They've done their own math in terms of saying this is the optimum price to guard market share, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the transition will give these countries a lot more bargaining power. And what they recognize is that over time, the world will wean itself off of oil, especially the developed economies of Europe and America. And so China, Pakistan, India, others are going to be long-term markets. But even they, if you look at India's electric mobility plans, is very ambitious as a project. They will also wean themselves off of this thing. So what the Saudis and others are in particular trying to do is keep prices up, maintain them on an upward trajectory, and then use those revenues to invest in industries of the future to guard themselves. And so Megan O'Sullivan had this fantastic foreign affairs essay written late in 2022, which made this very interesting argument that what we'll see is that countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia actually will grow their geopolitical clout in the near term, primarily as a result of this ongoing climate transition and renewable energy transition in the world.
Wonderful. So what do you see in terms of Pakistan's relations with Russia now? There are predictions that in the near future, Pakistan would be seen buying its oil from Iran and its gas from Russia. And that would mean that Pakistan would be completely out of the US bloc. And given how things are shaping up with the IMF right now, some of these predictions are coming to life. Do you think this is going to be the reality in the next few years?
I think, look, and I'll be as blunt as I can be on this, and some of your listeners will say, well, of course, he's sitting in Washington, so he's sort of touting an anti-Russia line. But if you look at all of the analysis that has been done over the years, Gonzalo Varela at the World Bank has done analysis on potential export partners for Pakistan. Russia is not an export partner for Pakistan. It is not an important market for Pakistan. Even in the energy side, the key markets and allies for Pakistan are Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And so if Pakistan wants to diversify into Russia and buy Russian oil, either through Central Asia by investing a huge chunk of money into these energy pipelines, it can try. They always be inefficient compared to what is accessible across the Arabian Sea. And cheaper. And in fact, they give you bailouts and loans and oil facilities that the Russians are incapable of providing, at least in the near term, given the shape of their own economy. And I think, Pakistan being a net importer of energy and being a country that is facing this protracted issue on balance of payments crises should be looking at where the world is going with renewable energy. And clean climate financing options available to really leapfrog ahead and build a new energy ecosystem on its own soil. And the reason for that is not only that it's good for the climate and good for the air quality in Pakistani cities and things like that, but the energy Pakistan makes today is very, very expensive. And the way to get over that hump is to have domestic energy be the bedrock. So Thar coal is a part of this, even though the world is not super happy with new investments in coal across the board. And I don't mean specifically Pakistan. So that would be a bit of a challenge that Pakistan will have to engage with the world and say, look, we need clean energy as well as cheap energy. And so Thar coal provides that base load capacity. But then if you look at the energy ecosystem in Pakistan, the only way to reduce its cost sharply, particularly to ordinary citizens, is by investing in things like distributed solar, not by buying Russian energy or Iranian gas. And so I think Pakistani policymakers need to sort of get away from more wishful thinking about how Russia is going to solve all of their problems and look at where the world is going in terms of investments in clean and renewable energy and build an energy ecosystem for the 21st century, not for the 20th century. And I think if Pakistan does not proactively make those investments, it'll actually be missing the boat yet again in a major revolution going on around the world, including in places like Saudi Arabia. And then 20 years later, we perhaps much older, much more grayer in our beards will have the same conversation about what were the opportunities missed in 2023. So my advice would be, look at the future and invest and partner with strategic historical friends, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, and China, and don't expect a whole lot from Russia because they have many of their own problems to solve for at this point in time.
Wonderful. Uzair, how do you see the projects that Pakistan has, power plant projects rather, that Pakistan has negotiated with China under the China-Pak Economic Corridor? And given that, this major realignment in the region is happening and, China is ruling the roost, do you think that it would be difficult for Pakistan to estrange from these commitments that Pakistan is making under the China-Pak Economic Corridor? Since you talk about investing in renewables locally, many of these projects are coal-fired power plants. Do you think it would be easy for Pakistan to estrange from some of these projects or backtrack from some of these projects in the future? And are we stuck for the next decade, or do you think that investing in renewables in Pakistan would be an option in the short term?
Well, I am in no way, shape, or form saying that Pakistan as a sovereign should renege on its commitments made to either domestic or foreign investors. It's one of the worst things a sovereign can do is to go back on its word and contracts, because that will lead to no future investment coming. And we've seen this with Recotech, for example, which was a very costly endeavor with the Supreme Court put Pakistan in a hole with. the way in which, there are two parts of this. One, again, there's this view in Washington around Chinese debt trap diplomacy. I fundamentally disagree with that argument, because it's not as if Pakistan did not have agency on borrowing money for critical infrastructure. You remember, and I remember very clearly, back in 2008, 2010, 18-hour load shedding. So Pakistan needed energy, and China was the only partner willing to step up to the plate and say, we're going to help solve your energy problems. And that problem was solved on the production side. Now it is up to Pakistan to say, okay, this energy costs X amount of dollars per kilowatt hour. What can we use it competitively for? If we have to make these payments in dollars because it's imported energy, and the financing came from abroad, well, are we earning enough dollars from this source of energy to be able to repay that? And that's on Pakistan, right? The other thing is, you're producing a lot of power, but then you need investments in the transmission and distribution system. Did you make those investments to make that system more efficient? The answer to that is broadly no. You have theft of electricity across the country. Did you try sustainably to solve it? The answer to that is no. And so did you fix the pricing issues? The answer to that is no. So you have over 4,000 billion rupees of circular debt across the energy ecosystem in Pakistan, and somebody's got to pay for this. So that's number one. Do you need those reforms? Along with that, countries need baseload capacity, which comes from fossil fuels, essentially, to be able to run their economy on a very systemic way and sort of be a part of the global modern economy. So that baseload capacity will remain. Now the challenge is, how do you grow the economy in a way where, obviously, with economic growth, the demand for energy will grow. And as that demand for energy grows, you sort of can maintain that base load. But on top of it, incremental investments are in the renewable sector and in decentralized networks and battery storage and things like that, industries of the future. So that you say, okay, for the next 20 years, I will need a certain base load capacity of fossil fuel-based energy. And not just that, there are nuclear is part of this, hydropower is part of this. And then on top, I'm going to add wind and solar and battery storage to smooth that curve and make energy cheaper. So I think it has to be a holistic approach. And as part of that holistic approach, countries like China will play a role, because China is a dominant player in the global solar market. It is immensely capable in battery storage solutions. It is immensely capable in electric vehicle production. So all of these things, particularly on the two-wheeler side, on the EV production side, all of those things are things that the Chinese, through a deep strategic relationship and a relationship based on economic fundamentals, can provide. Europe can also provide some of that. The United States can do that. The Saudis can do that. So it doesn't have to be an either-or situation here, but it has to be informed by what is good for Pakistan and its people, and what is the strategy that allows us to fully create an ecosystem that allows this economy to thrive.
So you're essentially saying that both these systems could thrive in parallel, and it's good news for Pakistanis that, we're not in a deep hole when it comes to the China-Pak economic corridor. Is that
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Pakistan is not the only hole that Pakistan is in right now is an economic hole, not a China hole, not an American hole, not a Saudi hole. It is a hole of Pakistan's own making. And it is only Pakistan that can come out of this hole on its own, and its friends will help lift it up out of that hole if Pakistan chooses to do so. And those friends are not just the Chinese or the Saudis. The Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese are also friends here. Nobody wants Pakistan to go down and bury itself in this hole. But for that, Pakistanis must be willing to lift themselves out, for starters.
Uzair, the only reason I'm resisting talking about Pakistan's economy is because I don't want this show to inevitably lead to Ishaq Dar, and I know you love that topic. So
we'll avoid that.
We'll avoid that. Yes, I'll move on to my next question, Uzair, and that is about this alliance that was building up in the region. Major players were the US, India, Australia, and Japan. I think it was called the Quad, if I'm not wrong. How do you see, the events shaping up in the region now and its implications for Quad? Because a lot of people are saying that with this new rise of China, and now China becoming this, coming up with this image of a benefactor in the region, and um, uh, fostering these new partnerships, especially between Saudi and Iran, and now, of course, given the Chinese influence in Pakistan also. Uh, uh, there are commentators that are saying that China has been effectively able to encircle India in the region. Do you see this as an encirclement of India?
Well, look, there is definitely a lot of concern with regards to China's rise in New Delhi, in Washington, D.C., in Canberra, in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Manila even. The Philippines president was just here in Washington, and prior to that, the South Koreans were here. And all of them have very openly expressed concern over China's rising influence in the region and are coming closer to the United States to help solve for this challenge that they face. So I think this rivalry between the United States and China is not just about the United States. It's primarily being driven by the challenge that smaller economies in the East Asian theater are facing. And that includes the Japanese in particular, who have fundamentally changed their national security posture in the last year or so. In the region itself, India is primarily concerned about this encirclement and what it believes is dead diplomacy of the Chinese in places like Sri Lanka, Pakistan. In Bangladesh, they're trying to come closer to Bangladesh to prevent a similar outcome. If you look at Nepal and Bhutan in the north, it's a concern over there. And of course, with Myanmar, China has significant investments there as well. So they're trying to find a way to operate in this environment where the region is sort of leaning more and more towards China. The way they've done this, and again, this is what I think even Pakistanis should pay attention to, not just India, but even Saudi Arabia, they're all recognizing that this will not be a unipolar or a bipolar world. This is a multipolar world, which means that you got to be friends with everybody and enemies with nobody, even when they might be your enemies. So if you look at India, for example, despite the exchange, and the fighting in the Himalayas, China and India continue to trade a lot. And even though, American companies and others are shifting manufacturing away from China, many Chinese companies are also investing in India for manufacturing of things like electronics in the country. So I think the world is going to be multipolar. And what countries will say is that, like Saudi Arabia, for example, will say, okay, we have a strategic relationship with Pakistan, but we will also open and make significant investments in India. We as the UAE will continue to engage with Pakistan to provide it, essential financing because the country is suffering. But we will also send Emaar to Srinagar and invest in Srinagar. And we will run flights from Sharjah to Srinagar as well, because we got to maintain that balance in our relationships. And you're seeing this with them in relation to Israel as well, for example. So I think in the region, all of these countries will balance and try to have relationships and a web of relationships with one another in a way that maximizes their economic and geopolitical prospects without coming to a point where there is a significant rupture that becomes a flashpoint in the region. And that's how they're all operating, in my view, which will mean that they will all do certain things that some of them don't like and will say and convey that message in private. But overall, they will try to maintain a net positive relationship with all of their friends in the neighborhood.
So Uzair, that's a very interesting point that you've raised. So does that really mean that economic necessities and economic considerations will continue to overshadow any geostrategic or diplomatic differences?
I would say absolutely, yes. And that the core reason for this is because this is a very young region. The median age of this region is below 40, holistically, if you were to look at all the way from Beirut down into, Calcutta, and then you cut across north and south. It's a very young region, and these young people are technologically and digitally connected with one another and the world. They're seeing a lot of opportunity around the world for disruption, for growth, for achievement, and they all have ambitions and aspirations. And so that desire of a young population to be part of a modern 21st century global economy and really live up to their aspirations will force the rulers in this region to respond to that desire and do the things that deliver economic prosperity and human development. And I think this is what is leading and forcing them all to be very pragmatic about their foreign and strategic policy, to the extent that, for example, we look at what's happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia recently. The only reason why there is a thaw in both these countries is because MBS is trying to keep the youth in his country on his side and reform the economy. So he needs breathing space over there. And in Iran, there have been significant protests, primarily led by young women against the regime because of the economic pain. So the regime is facing a bit of a pressure to say, okay, how can we create some openings that reduce the tensions in the region and allow us to trade a bit more, get a bit more investment from the region. The Turks have done that. The Syrians are doing that as well. So I think that's going to be the guiding principle here, is the ambitions and aspirations of young people will sort of control the worst instincts of these countries.
Thank you, Uzair. I'm loving this conversation, but we're also rushing towards the end of the show. We record for 30 minutes for each episode. So I'll just shoot my last question to you. My last question is that a lot of this discussion that we've done in the past 20-25 minutes has happened at the backdrop of a Saudi-Iran deal, a Saudi-Iran friendship. And do you think that this friendship, which has now happened with a lot of Chinese involvement, is sustainable? And do you think this would continue? Because we've seen in the past that Saudi and Iran have come together in the past also, but their talks, their negotiations haven't been very sustainable. Do you think this would be a sustainable relationship this time?
So look, I don't think this is going to turn into a friendship anytime soon. And it's okay if it doesn't turn into a friendship anytime soon. I think what we must encourage, and this is the view in Washington here as well, with the Chinese taking the lead on this, is that if the Chinese can encourage countries, especially Iran in the region, to be less of a revolutionary power and more of a status quo power that has disagreements in the region, but is not fundamentally willing to upset the status quo, then that's good. And I think the Saudis have a similar view. And I think, I hope that transition continues, that countries continue to talk to one another and engage and say, look, we may disagree on 80 out of 100 things, but there are things we agree on 20% of the time. Let's look at the positive and build on that. And I think that's what the Saudis and the Iranians are trying to do for reasons I described earlier. And I think this trend will continue. And I think it's consistent with not only what they, particularly the Saudis have been telling Pakistan and India, for example, right, is saying, yes, you have disputes, but look past them and look to the betterment of your people. It's better if everybody gets along a little bit better, not resolve all of your issues tomorrow. The Chinese have encouraged a similar thing. They frequently cite their relationship with Taiwan, where they say, look, we have a one China policy. It's at odds with what the Taiwanese see as their own sovereignty, but look at the trade and investment and tourism we do with one another, right? So I think that's where the region is trying to go to. I don't have a crystal ball in terms of saying how successful it will be, but at a personal level, I hope that the odds of things improve over time. Because that's the only way to deliver and fulfill the ambitions and aspirations of the people of this region. And any flashpoints, any more wars, any more conflicts, any proxy battles are just going to lead to another lost generation in the region, which none of us want.
Thank you, Uzair, for joining us and for very clear, targeted, and unambiguous responses to my questions. Ladies and gentlemen, Asad Ejaz Butt is signing off on New Wave Global.